Hello, I am Unknown Riddle. Apologies for the long delay, but I am back. This is a follow-up video to my first Undertale Deltarune Theory video that will focus on new information from chapters 3 and 4, which means there will be spoilers up ahead. Before I begin, I will say that I haven't watched any other theory videos about chapters 3 and 4, as I don't want to be consciously or unconsciously influenced by someone else's theories. I want this to purely be my thoughts and speculations. To begin, I went into making this video with the expectations that it would be 95% Deltarune content, with the only reference to my actual timeline being about whether or not Sans is the same character in both games. Between organizing my thoughts and the 10th anniversary Undertale stream, this ended up not being the case. Toby Fox made a special version of Undertale to be played on the anniversary stream that added a lot of world building to Undertale. I'll only be talking about 2 additions I think are relevant enough to this video. The first is Noelle appearing in Snowdin. While the people playing the game don't interact with her appearance is already enough to support my timeline and my assertions that Frisk and Chris are the same age, as she visually appears to be the same age as Frisk and Monster Kid. The second is Gerson appearing in a new area of Oldhome after a pacifist run. He gives more insight on what the war was like and its consequences. The most relevant parts being that the sides of the war weren't clear-cut, and while no humans died, there were rumors that it cost them their magic to seal the monsters underground. The fact that many humans opposed the war and fought alongside the monsters indicates that the human fear of losing their souls might not have been the cause of it, at least not on its own. This indicates to me that it was either a purposeful stoking of human fears by a specific group or individuals, or a perfect series of unfortunate events that led to the conflict breaking out, either of which could have failed or not happened in the Deltarune timeline. Humans possibly losing their magic and making the barrier is interesting, as until now we've heard no mention in either game of anything that causes someone to lose their magic. It was assumed that humans didn't have magic anymore in Undertale because Frisk didn't, or that they required artifacts like the one in Waterfall to do magic that don't exist on the surface anymore. Monsters can't do magic in Deltarune, and it's speculated that they lost it somehow. But there was never any mention of monsters being able to do magic previously, even in the newest chapters. So for all we know, this could just be a universe where monsters can't actively use magic. The fact that Toby decided to mention the possibility of being able to lose one's magic at all feels a bit too relevant to Deltarune's monsters not having magic to just be a bit of world building for Undertale. And monsters not having magic in Deltarune feels like it has to be actively relevant to the story somehow, because if Deltarune really is just a universe where monsters aren't magical, then they wouldn't still fall down and turn the dust when they die. If Toby wanted to show it was just a difference in how the world works, he would have had monsters die like humans and leave bodies behind. Monsters turn to dust because they're made of magic. Even though they've lost the ability to do active magic, they still turn to dust, so they still have to be made of magic. And now there's the active acknowledgement that magic could be lost. The problem is, Deltarune's story seems to have nothing to do with the human-monster conflict, or why monsters can't do magic. We're focusing on stopping the consequences of too many dark worlds and solving the conspiracy surrounding Hometown. Yet Chapter 4 goes out of its way to make sure we don't miss that monsters can still turn to dust, in case we skipped reading the library books. Gerson is in the church dark world despite being dead, and we find out this is because his dust is stored in the church. If all this speculation about the war and magic is relevant, how is it connected to Deltarune? I'd say it's most likely connected to the darkness that's darker than dark. In order for something to be so dark it becomes negative light, magic has to be involved. It even gives Lightners, or at least monsters, the ability to use magic. So what if this special darkness is what gives someone the power to use magic? If dark magic and monster magic are 2 different types of magic, then that could explain how monsters could lose their magic and still be made of magic. In Undertale, humans used all their dark magic to make the barrier sealed within the earth. When Gaster experiments with darkness, he uses determination to pierce a hole into the dark magic of the barrier, allowing the pure magical darkness to fill up the room he's in and transform it. Since the dark magic is free-flowing rather than being manifested by a person, it gives life to everything and transforms the area into something fantastical, with an existing history that reflects how everything was used in the light world. If this is the case, then the war not happening in Deltarune finally has relevance. Chris is the only human we've seen in Deltarune, and doesn't have magic in the light world, implying that humans still lost their magic here as well. If the war never started and monsters also don't have magic, I'd wager the war was avoided by both humans and monsters voluntarily sealing up their magic underground in order to assuage the fear that started the war in Undertale. With all the dark magic of humans and monsters sealed in the area around Hometown, dark fountains could be made anywhere. Plus, exploring the point of divergence between Undertale and Deltarune and the loss of magic would then be relevant. I'm going to pause this point here until we reach the conclusion of this video where I put everything together. For section 2, there's one other part of Undertale I want to talk about before moving on to the Deltarune side of things, and that is Sans. Previously, I had determined it wasn't the same Sans in both games since I believe Gaster went from Undertale to Deltarune, and that the events of Undertale happened earlier in its timeline than Deltarune's events in the Deltarune timeline. My stance on this has changed. Chapters 3 and 4 gave a connection to Undertale that I couldn't dismiss. At the end of Chapter 4, after the Dark World segment has ended, you can walk around the town at night. The song that plays during this segment is a variation of It's Raining Somewhere Else, a song associated with Sans, except this version is called The Place Where It Rains. In Undertale, Sans makes various remarks about not being able to go home, and how he gave up trying. The remarks seem to indicate him having a nihilistic mindset about escaping the barrier. However, a piece of dialogue in the No Mercy route hints at something else. Look, I gave up trying to go back a long time ago, and getting to the surface doesn't really appeal anymore either. This piece of dialogue indicates that the surface isn't what he's talking about. Additionally, his Lost Soul dialogue implies something similar. You'll never see him again. Most of us assumed until Deltarune that he was referring to Gaster, as it was and is a common theory that he is Sans and Papyrus's father. I and others assume he meant he was trying to get Gaster back, after he disappeared by repairing the broken machine in his secret lab. However, once Deltarune came out, this shifted to believing he meant getting back to the Deltarune timeline, due to the picture you can also find in his lab showing 3 smiling figures with the words, "Don't forget." I claim this was just meant to be a reference since it was purposely vague, and Sans is known for teasing lore and then actually meaning something else just to mess with you. I went with this opinion because Sans coming from Deltarune to Undertale conflicts with my parallel timeline theory in 2 different ways. It's commonly thought that Sans and Papyrus moved to Snowdin because Gaster suddenly disappeared. This can't happen if Gaster went from Undertale to Deltarune unless it's not the same Sans or Papyrus. The second issue is that with Deltarune taking place further in time than Undertale, Sans and Papyrus would have had to time travel in addition to dimensional traveling in order to be around for the events of Undertale. However, with the music itself indicating that Deltarune is the somewhere else that Sans misses, I can't deny this theory anymore. Which is a problem since it contradicts my previous theory, which I really believe is true. Or at least it did. After thinking through enough times, I realized there are 2 factors I missed that could make this fit. The first is that I and most of the community have taken it for granted that Sans and Papyrus arrived in the underground together with Gaster. It seems logical with the connections between him and Sans. The sprite we assume is Gaster looks like a skeleton. He speaks in a different font like Sans and Papyrus, as seen in Entry 17. and Sans' skull lasers are called Gaster blasters. It's easy to assume from this that they knew each other personally and ended up in the underground through the same means. But that's all it is, an assumption. Remove this assumption, and we solve the first contradiction with my theory, as now Gaster could start in Undertale, and Sans and Papyrus could start in Deltarune. This doesn't solve the second problem of Sans and Papyrus ending up in the Undertale universe years after the monsters leave the underground, if they arrive there after Deltarune has already happened. This is solved by a different character whose actions I completely missed the consequences of. That being Flowey. My previous theory only mentions his creation and a vague summary of his actions, as I didn't think anything else was relevant for a timeline meant to craft a Deltarune theory. This means I completely missed the fact that his power of reset stops time from moving forward, and that he did this hundreds if not thousands of times. We know from his New Home dialogues in the No Mercy route that he's reset enough times to memorize everything in the underground to the point of growing bored enough to then start killing monsters and then growing bored of that. The consequences of all this resetting means that the Undertale timeline suddenly halts and starts looping while the Deltarune timeline keeps going. If the resets happened hundreds of thousands of times, the timeline could be halted for long enough that the events of Deltarune happened before Undertale does. We also know what Flowey was doing when he lost his powers. Sans warns us, during his break at Grilby's, that a flower had been talking to Papyrus. The most interesting thing to Flowey at that point is Papyrus, implying that he hasn't memorized everything Papyrus could possibly say or do yet. Flowey also has dialogue after multiple neutral endings where he confirms that he's learned to stay away from Sans, which explains why he's only focusing on Papyrus. Papyrus is naive and optimistic, which would get Flowey to play the long con to see if he can trick Papyrus into either helping him get the human souls or doing something awful and seeing what happens. This whole explanation serves as a solution for the second contradiction in my theory. Flowey's resets halted the timeline for so long that when Sans and Papyrus flee from the events of the Deltarune universe, the monsters are still trapped underground with only 6 souls. As a consequence of 2 new playthings suddenly showing up, one of which seems very easy to manipulate, Flowey eventually goes long enough without resetting for Frisk to fall down and take that power. With these issues cleared up, I am now on board with the theory that it's the same Sans between each game. This ends Section 2, and we can move on to Deltarune itself. Section 3 is about Gaster and the Knight. I am still convinced that Gaster is orchestrating everything, and that the Knight is his servant that carries out his orders outside the shelter. The Knight's identity is the first area of focus, as that leads to my thoughts on the other things. We finally get our first appearance of the Knight in Chapter 3. It lacks any distinguishing features beyond what looks like antlers coming out of its head. We end up following it from the TV Dark World fountain all the way down to the shelter where it locks itself and Undyne inside. In the next chapter, Chris is seemingly listening to the Knight on their cell phone after they've removed the soul. Later, when Susie grabs something plot important, Chris calls the same person to tell them, and they mention that they're on their way. Soon, we finally see Noelle's mom, Carol Holiday, who comes home much sooner than Noelle expected. If you did enough searching around, you can also find out that Carol owns a katana. She immediately wants Susie gone, but mentions as you leave that Chris is always welcome. All this evidence seems to indicate that Carol is the Knight. She even has horns that point behind her like the Knight's antlers. However, many people, including myself, believe this is a little too easy to figure out. Comments from the old man in Chapter 4 about how stories can suffer from being too predictable further indicate that Carol Holiday being the Knight is a red herring. If this is the case, then who actually is the Knight? Susie spotted the Knight heading to the shelter in the light world, so we know they have to be a Lightner at the very least. The Knight's one noticeable feature is their antlers. I imagine antlers on a Lightner would translate to the dark world like hair does, meaning that they don't change much beyond maybe changing colors. This narrows down the suspects to the Holiday family. The person Chris was on the phone with seems to be gasping out their words like they could barely speak. Carol spoke initially in short phrases, but those were spoken with strict sternness, and that dropped when speaking with Chris alone. This gasping speaking style would better fit Rudy Holiday, who's more exhausted than usual at the hospital because he went to church that day. Him being the knight could fit. Chris calls him, and then he calls his wife to tell her to come home early. Him being sick in the hospital could be an act so that he'd have the ability to create dark fountains without being seen. However, the issue with Rudy being the knight is why. Carol has been described and been observed to be cold and harsh. You could see her being villainous. Rudy seems far too kind-hearted to be doing this. Trying to end the world means killing Noelle and Des as well, and his love for them seems genuine. This makes me further question why anyone working with the knight is doing so. I just mentioned how nice Rudy is, but Chris is also helping the knight. Creating the TV Dark World could have been a selfish act, but they deliberately stop us from seeing key information to the point of fighting the soul in Des's closet. They are also ordered to keep that key information from Susie in the phone call scene. One could assume from their history of mean pranks that Chris is secretly a malicious person that might want to watch the world burn. Or, alternatively, that making the roaring happen would free them from the soul inhabiting their body. However, we can spot details in the game that say otherwise. For one, they actually like being friends with Susie. We may choose for them to play with and interact with Susie in the church and diner scenes, but Chris decides how they're going to do that. They pour juice into Susie's mouth without hesitation while she does the same to them, and they also high-five her on their own. The most telling of all is in the Chapter 4 Weird Route, where you can eavesdrop on Noelle speaking to Chris alone in her room. You find out that on the Weird Route, Chris snuck into her property during the night to apologize to Noelle for freaking her out in the hospital and taking her watch. They said it was a stupid prank, that Birdley will be alright, and that they removed a thorn from her hand. Furthermore, if you push the Weird Route and make Chris put the thorn back, Chris will be so enraged that he takes the soul to the bathroom, throws it into a trash can, and smashes it repeatedly, despite the fact that hurting the soul will also hurt them. If Chris was really a bad person, they wouldn't have gone out of their way to help and comfort Noelle about what happened in Chapter 2, especially after being up all night dealing with another dark fountain. This, more than anything, cements to me that Chris is actually a good person. So why would Chris work with the person trying to bring about the apocalypse? For all she seems like a mean person, why would Carol want to ruin the world? She had a family, and is the one person making all the decisions in her town. Even selfishly, it makes little sense to destroy everything she's worked for. If it makes no sense for Chris, Carol, and possibly Rudy to willingly be working for the prophecy, then they must be doing it unwillingly. So what could make them help with the prophecy? One thing they all have in common is that they all care about Noelle, which means they also likely care about Des. If Gaster did kidnap Des, then he could use her as leverage to make certain people do what he wants. Maybe that's what the haunting message in the code was, a recording sent to her parents to make them cooperate, and to Chris so that they'll accept being the vessel for the soul. In exchange, Des will remain alive. In that case, either parent could be the knight. Perhaps they take turns. So long as they have the same Lightworld outfit and whatever the equivalent is to the knight's helmet head, they could interchangeably be the knight. However, there is one aspect of the knight that makes it difficult to pin a regular Lightner as the knight: its ability to shapeshift. When you fight the knight, it starts the battle by roaring. When it does this, its jaw seems to unhinge and its chest opens up like ribs before reforming. It does the same during its final attack. It also transforms into a floating orb when traveling. When it takes Undyne, it transforms into a bird-like creature in order to carry her away. Its ability to constantly fly without wings is also notable. No other Lightner we've seen can shapeshift or fly in the Dark World. The closest thing is the old man being able to change outfits instantly when his fight starts. Whoever the knight is, they aren't a normal Lightner. They haven't just been brainwashed, but experimented on and modified. It took a while to figure out what their shapeshifting reminded me of, but when it hit me like a truck. Their roaring animations reminded me of the Amalgamates. That's what the Knight is. A monster injected with determination. If monster dust regains its form in the Dark World, then an amalgamate would have increased control over its melty form, able to shapeshift at will, especially since it's probably not merged with any other monsters. Being a melty blob in the light world would fit Susie being unable to identify it in the dark as it dragged Undyne to the shelter. There are only 2 missing monsters from Hometown. The fact that one is supposedly at college, and that the Knight's apparent default form includes horns means it can only be one person. My theory remains the same. Des is the Knight. Gaster kidnapped her and injected her with excess amounts of determination. The amalgamates in Undertale seem to have lost their sense of self since melting. Part of that might be due to being merged with other monsters, but it seems like melting has certain effects on their mental state. This, combined with being kept away from people they know, has led to their memories fading. Des, now having lost her physicality, slowly loses her memories of who she is as Gaster keeps her in the shelter. This makes her more suggestible, and Gaster continues to influence her into believing that she is a knight whose purpose is to fulfill the prophecy. After years of this, she's the perfect servant with her memories repressed and is only focused on completing her destiny. I'll be ending this section here and save further speculation for the final part. In Section 4, I'll be talking about Susie, the prophecy, and her possible ability to subvert the prophecy. To start, we need to talk about how odd the prophecy in Deltarune is. Unlike most other prophecies I've seen in fiction, it is detailed and precise rather than short and vague. Typical prophecies give a vaguely worded statement about how something bad will happen, or how the big bad will finally be defeated. We only saw fragments of Deltarune's prophecy in Chapter 4, but what we saw detailed specific moments throughout the story, down to a specific insult Lancer calls Ralsei. Ralsei himself says the prophecy details everything that has happened and will happen, implying that the entirety of the game until then is fully documented somewhere in the church to that level of detail. At the end of Chapter 4, Ralsei tells us that him encouraging us to be nice and as merciful as possible was the way he hoped to get a better ending. He then tells us that although he's not sure of that anymore, Susie has inspired him to continue to find a better ending, which tells us that as far as Ralsei can tell, the prophecy has played out exactly as predicted up to this point. A prophecy this precise that seems impossible to subvert has horrifying implications about free will in this world, which better explains why Jevil and Spamton are obsessed with freedom. They aren't self-aware that they're in a game, they're made aware that they live in a fatalistic world after someone, presumably Gaster, told them about the prophecy. Queen demonstrates in Chapter 2 that the prophecy isn't something all Darkners know. Otherwise, she wouldn't have gone through with her plan to make more fountains. Therefore, neither of them would know of it before then. Someone who has memorized a prophecy that detailed could tell Spamton who exactly he needs to sell what item to in order to have maximum success constantly. And when that person stopped calling him or refused to tell him anything else, his success crumbled away. It's not just the wording that's precise either. The prophecy we see in Chapter 4 also has images accompanying it that are accurate depictions of what's being talked about. That prediction about Lancer came along with a picture of Lancer that's only slightly stylized. When it talks about the Queen's chariots, it shows her limousines rather than actual horses. When it talks about Ralsei, it shows the hooded form we first met him in at the beginning of Chapter 1. When it talks about Chris, it shows the soul we play as in the cage that is Chris's body. This sort of accuracy leads to the first clue that Susie can defy the prophecy. For the girl, it shows someone in what looks like a robe with a sword. None of the images of the 3 heroes show their faces, but you'd think it'd at least show Susie's outline or her holding an axe. This has led me, and I'm sure many others, to the conclusion that the girl in the prophecy is actually supposed to be Noelle. As in the Chapter 2 Dark World, she wore a white cloak with a hood. Chapter 3 Shadow Mantle side quest has Chris playing a video game depicting him and a white-cloaked ice mage navigating a dungeon, implying Noelle should be the second hero. Whatever way Rousey memorized the prophecy probably didn't have images if he hasn't noticed this. This is evidenced by his telling of the prophecy in Chapter 1, clearly showing illustrations of Susie as the second hero. Susie being here instead of Noelle means Susie is already starting to change the prophecy. Just think for a moment what the story of Deltarune with Noelle as the monster hero instead of Susie would be like, and how it'd have to happen. Susie and Chris went to the storage closet because Susie ate all the chalk. Because she was last to arrive, Alphys asked her to get some, and asked Chris to accompany her so it'd actually get done. In order for Noelle to take her spot, Susie would have to arrive to school on time or early, or not eat the chalk. However, in Chapter 2, Susie implies that she regularly comes in late when she tells Chris that she wouldn't have come on time if they were going to be late. Because of this, Susie changing the prophecy by being late doesn't make sense. Her being late is predictable enough that the prophecy would have taken it into account. Her deciding to eat chalk that day could be it. We only saw her eat one piece. Maybe Chris preemptively took the rest so that Alphys would run out and ask for someone to get more from the closet. Let's say that happened. In order to go to the closet, Chris steals most of the chalk during the night and then ends up sleeping in. Once Alphys runs out of chalk, she asks if anyone will get her more from the closet, and Chris volunteers. This makes Alphys suspicious, and she asks Noelle to go with them to make sure it actually happens. With things playing out as they should, Chris encourages Noelle to follow them into the dark closet and into the Castletown dark world. Chapter 1 would be more straightforward, as Noelle would have no problems taking battle orders from Chris and wouldn't join Lancer as a bad guy. The Fun Gang would make their way through Card Kingdom without having to warn the doctors about Susie's attacks, and humor Lancer's attempts to be evil, eventually befriending him. The adventure plays out broadly like it actually did in Chapter 1, with Lancer overthrowing King. Noelle would be mortified about missing school, but would be eager to see if all that was real the next day, and would make an excuse to Birdley that they could meet up at the library later. She also tells this to Susie too. Remember that the prophecy says the girl will find love, so Susie still has to be part of this. Chapter 2 plays out with the difference being that Queen is constantly trying to capture Noelle, rather than her immediately being captured and then escaping much later, and that Susie is one of her minions by choice as she hasn't had character development, and will take the excuse to fight people. Once they reach the mansion, things play out like they actually did, except Susie doesn't care about puzzles and ignores them. Because of her not doing a puzzle before he does, Birdley would be able to maintain his facade of being the smartest and stall his character development. Rescuing Noelle would go similarly, except she would insist on joining Chris and Rousey instead of staying with Birdley, leaving him and Susie to have wires attached to them and fight for Queen during her boss fight. The rest would play out like normal. Noelle and Chris are much closer now and hang out after school. They'd visit Rudy in the hospital before we get control of Chris again. Being old family friends, Noelle would be allowed to sleep over at Chris's house like Susie, which leads to Chapter 3. Noelle being there instead of Susie makes sense, as she is actually relevant to Tenna's backstory as being one of the last people to stop watching him. Without Susie to stall the night until Undyne arrives, they take both Toriel and Undyne to the shelter, resulting in a different Chapter 4. Not too different though. Remember, the Mastermind's goal is to make the prophecy play out as is, not for the Roaring to succeed. Therefore, the three heroes need to know how to beat a Titan. That's why the Knight stayed in the Chapter 4 Dark World despite Toriel not being there, and why the Knight hasn't spawned dark fountains all over the place and started the Roaring yet. Even if Toriel had gotten taken in Chapter 3, another dark fountain would have been made so that the heroes could learn how to beat Titans. We can only speculate about Chapter 5 and beyond, but I think a lot can be guessed based on the fact that Susie was able to stop Toriel from being taken. Toriel was targeted because of the symbols on the shelter door. A police badge, a pine tree, and the Deltarune indicate a way to unlock the door. A code for the shelter is found in Chapter 4 in Dess's guitar, but we were unable to fully read it before it was taken by Noelle's mom. The existence of this code indicate that each of the people indicated by the symbols has or knows the code for the shelter. the mayor, the police chief, and the head of the church. The mayor is Carol Holiday, who is already working against us. The police chief is Undyne, who was taken in Chapter 3, and the head of the church was Gerson, who has passed away. Responsibility for the code was then passed down to Toriel, as she's one of the oldest and most responsible members of the church, as indicated by her leading choir practice. She likely plans to pass this duty down to Father Alvin when she thinks she's ready. Given what we learn about Father Alvin's insecurities, I doubt he's inherited all of his father's responsibilities yet. The code in the guitar indicates that each of these individuals have a code written down somewhere. Carol Holiday likely hid the note with the code in her missing daughter's room because she knew Asgore would search her own room for it when she hired him as a housekeeper. It's a well-known fact that Carol takes everything important home with her to her room rather than keep it in her office in City Hall. Asgore would have lost access to the police code after he was replaced by Undyne. Given that part of the prophecy we see in Chapter 4 indicates that Chapter 5 will take place in Asgore's flower shop, I can't see the police station being the penultimate Dark World. Therefore, I believe the police code is on the back of the police chief's badge, which means kidnapping Undyne is all the knight has to do on the police side of things. The Deltarune code is likely kept in the church, which means the knight would have spawned a titan there even if Toriel had been kidnapped so they could take it. That leaves the guitar as the only remaining code left if all had gone to plan. With Noelle as the second hero, the portion of Chapter 4 at her house might not have happened. Once it was time to let them into the shelter, all that would have to happen is for the knight to be revealed as Des at the end of a chapter. This would prompt Chris and Noelle to enter her old room and find the note in the guitar. But this isn't guaranteed to happen anymore. Everything is beginning to slide off course thanks to Susie deciding to impulsively eat all the chalk. This whole alternate story happens because Noelle is much more passive and subservient than Susie. Noelle not being the second hero is why only Chapter 2 has a complete weird route. If Noelle was the second hero, I'd imagine the other chapters would have had full weird routes. Susie accidentally taking the hero role has had changes that are building up. Susie's active choices have helped everyone around her. She got Birdley to drop the smart guy act, she gave Tenna hope that he wouldn't be thrown away, and she stopped Toriel from being taken by the knight. Without Susie, we might never have had a segment in the Holiday House in Chapter 4. Her tendency to make big choices herself, rather than always leaving it up to Chris, will allow her to defy the prophecy. This conclusion ends Section 4. In this final section, we will use the previous 4 conclusions to piece together how Deltarune will end. But before we actually start, we have one more thing to go over because Toby Fox decided to casually drop Shadow Crystal lore on his Bluesky account. He posted Chapter 5 Sham dialogue where he states,
Shadow crystals are far more than mere pieces of glass. In actuality, they contain a certain power. You could call this the power of will. No, perhaps will isn't right. The power they contain is...
This trails off, but the obvious name we're supposed to draw for this power of will is determination. This makes sense, as when we select the shadow crystal from the item menu, we see a different outcome when Chris peers through it. The crystals allow one to see different outcomes of the present moment. It's revealed that Asgore has one in Chapter 4 if you snoop around the Holiday House long enough. He likely saw his family together again in the glass, which is why he's trying to find proof of what actually happened all those years ago. It also makes sense why they make darkness stronger. According to Ralsei in Chapter 3, darkners aren't technically real, so if a darkner gains determination from a shadow crystal, a will to live beyond their purpose, they'd be more real than a regular darkner, and therefore more powerful. With that out of the way, we can begin with Conclusion 1. Darkness is the result of humans and monsters giving up their magic and sealing it within the earth. If the roaring is all this darkness being released at once and taking an unstoppable form, You'd need a way to reduce the darkness that's faster than sealing the individual fountains and titans. If dark magic is something monsters gave up, then it stands to reason that they can absorb it again. I believe that in the process of stopping the roaring, monsters will regain the ability to use magic, which will result in the titans getting weaker. They won't be able to absorb all the darkness, as it's the combined dark magic of monsters and humans. Conclusion 2. Sans and Papyrus flee Deltarune into Undertale, which prompts Flowey to cease resetting long enough for Frisk to fall down. This is almost certainly done through the broken machine in Sans' lab. Because Sans is unable to fix it, we can surmise that he wasn't the one that built it. The only one with the technical knowledge to make it in the Deltarune universe would be Gaster. I don't have enough evidence to put forth a solid guess on how well Sans and Papyrus know Gaster and Deltarune, if at all, but the fact that they move into the town just before the main story is about to begin indicates that Sans at least might be aware of what's going on and what might happen. It also might give a better explanation for his behavior at the end of Chapter 4. He gets Toriel drunk enough that she forgets her own kid hasn't come back by curfew and spends the whole night partying. And when Chris finally gets home, she's too drunk to be upset and can barely stand up straight. Then he insists that they keep playing loud music and partying, despite the fact that he knows her kid just wants to go to sleep. This seems unusually callous for Sans. His antics even in Deltarune have never been this messed up until now. However, if he's somehow aware that Toriel is being targeted, perhaps that was his way of making sure she wasn't alone for the rest of the day and night. Though even I think this is a stretch. The main point is, Sans in some way being aware of Gaster gives him reason to find and use the machine to end up in Undertale. So why did Gaster make this machine? The fact that it took Sans and Papyrus to Undertale means it's meant to travel through dimensions. Gaster likely intended to use this machine to follow the soul into the angel's heaven, the higher dimensional reality that some would speculate is our real world. As in my previous theory, I believe it's a higher reality where its inhabitants interact with Lightners like how Lightners interact with Darkners. To put it another way, he's doing what other RPG final bosses do and trying to usurp God. The relation to Conclusion 2 is that during the final chapter of Deltarune, when it looks like the heroes might lose, Sans will throw in the towel and steal the machine with Papyrus and Bale, screwing over Gaster in the process. Conclusion 3 is that the knight is Des, who has been injected with excess determination and melted into an amalgamate. The antagonist being a brainwashed older sibling means that the obvious narrative direction is for her identity to be revealed while Noelle is there, thus resulting in a classic I know you're in there fight. So we can surmise that Noelle will return to the party in at least the final chapter, and that Des will likely regain memory of who she is, and even might become our ally during the final climactic battle. Amalgamates can be influenced to remember people they care about, as seen in Undertale with Snowdrake's mother. This leads us to the last conclusion. Susie's ability to impulsively make choices rather than always turning to Chris will allow her to defy the prophecy. This means she must do something that wouldn't happen if Noelle was the second hero. The first thing that comes to my mind is that she will be the one to discover that you can perform magic in the light world if you absorb dark magic. Susie is clearly meant to be a physical fighter, but she's made the choice to learn healing magic from Ralsei anyway. It makes sense that she would be the one to try and absorb dark magic in a moment of desperation. I also believe she has already done something that will allow us to change fate. If you beat the knight in Chapter 3, they don't automatically drop the Shadow Crystal. They only lose the crystal when Susie decides to clash with them one last time. If Noelle was in her place, the third Shadow Crystal would have never been obtainable, even if the knight was defeated. Because Susie's actions allowed us to get the knight's crystal, Sham will be able to make whatever item requires 6 Shadow Crystals. I believe this item will be key in changing the outcome of the final battle. As previously discussed, new dialogue dropped by Toby indicate that the shadow crystals contain determination, which in this universe is the power to change fate. Now that I've extrapolated predictions from each of my conclusions, I can put together my theory on how the rest of Deltarune will play out. Chapter 5's Dark World will likely take place in Asgore's flower shop, and there are 3 pieces of evidence for this. The first is the prophecy snippet that you can find in Chapter 4 that shows Asgore as a king behind a flower. The second is Gerson's summary of the 5th chapter of his book that's based on the prophecy. Chapter 5, The Field of Pink and Gold. The vast garden is charred in an inferno of jealousy. This description would fit a flower shop transformed into a fantasy world. The third reason is that Asgore has a shadow crystal, and we'll have to be able to get it from him eventually. Since the knight is training us to take on the Titans, the chapter will end with a fight against 2 Titans to slowly build up to the Roaring, which is depicted with 3 Titans when Ralsei talks about it. The festival is the day after Chapter 4 happens, so I imagine that Chris and Susie will be drawn to the flower shop before the festival gets into full swing, because no one has seen Asgore that morning and flowers are needed for the festival. They discover the Dark World and enter it. There's almost certainly going to be a confrontation with Asgore where we get the Shadow Crystal, and more info on how he lost his job as the police chief. This will be followed by a fight against 2 Titans to prepare the heroes for the Roaring. What happens after and in Chapter 6 is less predictable, but there are a few clues. Since I believe Noelle has to be involved again, the Dark World has to be somewhere where Noelle would logically be. The school and library have already been done. The only other obvious places are the hospital and her house, and Rudy as previously mentioned wanting to join Noelle in the festival. He was able to make it to church in Chapter 4, so I'll imagine he'll be out of the hospital for at least a little while. This leaves the holiday house. This makes sense as after getting more details from Asgore and the knight ramping up the 2 Titans, it feels like time is running out. But Susie knows about the shelter code in the guitar. She'd think to go get it while the mayor is out running the festival, and Noelle would join them since Susie already planned to take Noelle to the festival anyway. This happens earlier than it should because of Susie. It was her pounding on the shelter door at the end of Chapter 3 that revealed the code panel and the symbols. It was also her idea because of this to search the holiday house in Chapter 4. If it was Noelle instead, the panel would have never been revealed, and there'd be no reason to search her house and to go into her missing sister's room. We wouldn't know the code was in the guitar and would have no idea how to proceed once it feels like the Roaring is imminent. So this means the heroes need to be delayed. The knight makes a dark world within the holiday house, and Noelle joins us on this one. We confront the knight, and their identity is revealed as Des. Noelle will be able to get through to her enough that she won't be an enemy anymore. We steal the fountain and learn the shelter code from the guitar, or Des herself, and set off to enter it. But it seems like it's too late. The knight has made other dark fountains before coming to delay the heroes as part of the original plan to start the Roaring. Darkness is now seeping out of the cracks of the earth, and everyone can see it. It seems like you'll have to confront a trio of Titans and stop the Roaring as the prophecy intended after all, and play out the final tragedy you've been trying to avoid. We don't know what this tragedy is, but I have a guess. The soul we play as is what's able to seal Dark Fountains and defeat the Titan at the end of Chapter 4. If it has to dispel not just 3 Titans, but the darkness blanketing a whole town, and we don't have the time to seal every Titan and newly made fountain up one at a time, then it'd have to be one overwhelming burst. Something of that magnitude could kill the cage around the soul. I believe the final tragedy is that Chris will have to die in order to stop the Roaring. Susie has already seen the final part of the prophecy and knows what's coming. In her desperations, she ends up absorbing some of the dark magic and is able to use her magic in the light world. Alternatively, if Toriel is just as old as she is in Undertale, then she would remember a time when magic did exist. Susie stopped her from being kidnapped, so perhaps she could be the one to give Susie the idea. Either way, she then instructs the rest of the town who don't know what to do about the surrounding darkness to do the same, and they each absorb some of the darkness and gain the ability to do magic. While this doesn't fix everything, the town stops shaking itself to pieces, and all that's left is 3 titans. Once you seal each of them, the darkness finally recedes. This is the time I think we'll find out what Ralsei is, as he'll be so ecstatic at defying the prophecy that he'll forget to retreat to Castletown before the darkness disappears. Chapter 6 will end on the knowledge that one last confrontation awaits them in the shelter. Chapter 7 begins where 6 ended. I can't imagine Chris and Susie would be allowed to go into the shelter alone. I think it's more likely that they sneak off as the town's people start putting things back together, rather than risk anyone else getting hurt. Players paying attention will note that Sans and Papyrus have disappeared. So, they sneak off with the item that becomes Ralsei in Dark Worlds and enter the shelter, as they know the code now. We saw at the end of Chapter 3, when the shelter doors were opened briefly, that it's also full of darkness, so this will be the final Dark World. After navigating and maybe learning the personal history of the mastermind, we finally meet W.D. Gaster in person. He is far from happy. Not only has the roaring failed, but the machine he built to travel into the Angel's Heaven was stolen sometime after the roaring started. He won't name names, but it can be guessed that Sans grabbed Papyrus and stole the machine when things looked their worst, and presumably ended up in Undertale. This means Gaster will have to resort to a much riskier plan to get what he wants. He's long been aware of what dark magic is and that it can be absorbed, so he created multiple dark fountains within the Shelter Dark World, once again releasing the remaining dark magic of 3 titans, and absorbing all of it into himself. Gaster himself becomes a titan of gargantuan size, and plans to use the reality-breaking powers of dark magic to break into the Angel's Heaven himself. Thus begins the final titan battle against Gaster. It's during this battle that I predict the knight will return looking more like Des and fight alongside us, as she also knows how to get into the shelter. I also believe that the item made from the shadow crystals will come into play here. Much like the shadow mantle with the knight, this item will allow us to not die instantly to Titan Gaster. It's technically possible to beat him without the item, but you're not going to unless you're a masochist. I can't predict how the fight will specifically go. However, unlike with regular titans, Gaster is a living being combined with reality-bending magic. When his form is dispelled, he ends up shattered across time and space, just as his followers in Undertale said he was. On very rare occasions, enough pieces can keep themselves together long enough to manifest a visible form, only seen by going through a monochrome version of a Dark World door. Back home, there is joy to be had. The prophecy was subverted, and dark magic still exists under the earth, so Castletown and Ralsei are able to continue to exist, now being visited by other townsfolk. Des is reunited with her family, but can't always keep a solid form. Chris is free of the soul and can be themselves again. Now that the truth of what happened all those years ago has come out, Toriel is apologetic and much less hostile towards Asgore. They are able to be friends again, but it is unclear if they'll ever be more again. Besides that, the only other thing I can predict about the epilogue is that we'll get to see Asriel come home to a family that is much more together than when he left, and sees Chris has close friends in Susie and Noelle now. Given that the soul is our viewpoint into this world, it will likely return to where it came from shortly after, and will cease being able to see into that world. And that, ladies and gentlemen and envies, is my Deltarune prediction. Thank you so much for watching until the end. Please do like and subscribe, and comment your own theories. Join me next time for What If Super Smash Bros. Brawl had endings. With that, I leave you with this riddle. I am a cold world trapped in a glass prison. What am I?